You are watching Direct Line Live with Mark Uncapher. Take it away, Mark.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dwight. I almost feel like with Dwight's introduction, we should have a studio band or something to kind of play our theme music, but we haven't reached that point. I'm joined tonight with Don Irvine. Don of Accuracy and Academia. I'm having trouble with academia today. And speaking of academia, we have, I'm looking at the Zoom thing that says Timothy Olson, but we actually have Walter Olson. Truth in Advertising, Timothy is Walter's son and has very graciously been able to accommodate his father with the right technical equipment. We're going to talk tonight about the Supreme Court, and particularly the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. And really one of the right people to talk to is Walter, because you are you get the precise fellow or senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and has also written.
Hey guys, hold on 1 second. We're having some technical issues. Give me 2 minutes.
Is that something I said?
That could be.
This is like instead of the 17-second delay, it's like the 37-second delay.
Oh.
Still bound to go smoother than last time with Robin.
We had Robin Ficker on. It was a bit of a challenge. Unfortunately, on this show, we don't have any virtual M&Ms to offer you in the green room.
1 second, I'm going to reboot OBS. Give me a minute. Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode of Direct Line Live with our host, Mark Uncapher. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you very much, Dwight. And you would make a great band leader if we had an orchestra behind you to be able to do the introduction. I'm joined with my co-host, Don Irvine of Accuracy and Academia, and also with a board member, actually treasurer of the Montgomery County Republican Club, which hosts this. And we're very pleased to have tonight with us, not Timothy Olson, but Walter Olson. Timothy Olson that's there is actually Walter's son, who has stepped in the breach and has made his equipment available so that Walter can come on. We're going to be talking about the Supreme Court, and more specifically the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. And we probably have one of the better people to talk about this. Walter is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and has in his career focused very extensively on legal issues, being over-lawyered. I cringe a little bit when I hear that title, because you and I are both lawyers. Even though we know that's an issue, how can I say, maybe 3 years of law school made us take it a little bit too personally. But we're talking about the Supreme Court and not that. So welcome to the show, Walter.
Thank you. I should say I'm actually not a lawyer, even though I've spent my whole career working law.
In his career focus.
I just criticize who happened.
Well, and deservedly so too. But that's an interesting approach that I did not know. Now, and just for our Maryland viewers, you have been very active. And deservedly so too. But because of your work on the Redistricting Commission that the governor set up and did a lot of work on that, hearings around the state, and we really appreciate your leadership on that. But let's talk about the nomination. So how does it look right now?
It's looking very good for the nomination.
Hearings around
the Republicans have, if not a totally solid front, been solid enough to win a confirmation vote.
How does it look right now?
Next week, around Halloween, I think. And the hearings, which have, of course, sometimes provided fireworks and have sometimes damaged nominations in the past, people think the hearings went very well for Amy Coney Barrett. The public liked what they saw. The Democrats, for whatever reason, were not landing blows, and some of them were treating her a little more carefully than they've treated some of the other nominees.
That's true. In some respects, I'm wondering if Dianne Feinstein may have been hurt more politically by folks on the left who were frustrated with her questioning. There's always this tightrope that they have. We could go back to the Court of Appeals thing, but you want to comment first on how she handled these hearings?
Dianne Feinstein, you're right. She was whipsawed between the expectations of the left wing of the Democratic Party, which is very influential in California and always a possibility to knock people off in primaries. Who knows whether she'll run again? But she's got to worry about them. And at the same time, she really stepped in it a few years ago when Amy Coney Barrett was up for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, because at that point, there was a line of attack on her that she was too committed to conservative religious principles, and that was all summed up in a statement by Senator Feinstein, the dogma lives loudly within you. And that became a bumper sticker even. I think they reworded it, but it became a well-known catchphrase and a rallying point for kind of resistance to the idea that Democrats would be against nominations because of people's religious views. So this time, Feinstein was careful not to repeat the same mistake. But she, in the course of doing so, she did things like hug Lindsey Graham, something that I think most of us are relieved to see, that people can still hug and forgive and get along despite some pretty serious political differences. But for those left-wingers in California and around the country who had already been very suspicious of Dianne Feinstein, because she's never played with the farthest left factions over there, even when she was back in San Francisco, she didn't. So they pounced it, and I think most of us are relieved. What could be more outrageous than a bipartisan hug? So, I don't think she damaged herself as badly as some of her critics damaged themselves with that.
I think that's a fair point. But you're right about her balancing act. And I was going to reference the fact, Amy has been, or I should say judge, soon to be Justice, Barrett, has really been somebody who a lot of people have been watching as a potential Supreme Court nominee. I think it's fair to say from when she was also nominated for the Court of Appeals.
Very much so. And she has been, together with judges like Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, on the short list of those who were considered most likely to be appointed. She is young and didn't have as much mileage, as it were, on the appellate courts as Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. So logically, there were reasons why she would have to wait behind figures like them. But her name has been up there for a long time. Her academic career, which was brilliant, her write-ins, her very careful work on the appellate court. And I've had the chance to read over many of her decisions. And I can say this is a record on the appeals court where she didn't get overturned. I can't think of any case where she got overturned, where she didn't tend to provoke dissents. Even when she was on a panel with liberal judges, they did not dissent from what she wrote, nor did the full court. Occasionally, cases go up to hearing en banc, so-called, where the full court considers it, but she wasn't getting reversed in any way there either. She was writing opinions that were highly respected as good basic law and as very acute in their analysis. She got into issues where sometimes judges disagreed with each other, and she provided the persuasive arguments that kept the majority a unanimous one.
Now, she professionally, or as a law professor, had written quite a bit on the concept of stare decisis, which is the Latin term for issues that have been previously settled, and the reference that is given by judicial. How do you think that affects kind of her approach as a judge?
Well, it's fascinating because, of course, stare decisis, as we'll undoubtedly say in the conversation ahead, is right at the center of the question of what difference she will make on the Supreme Court. And it's a topic that she's written about extensively. She was, of course, a protege and clerk of Justice Antonin Scalia. And very much identifies with his originalism, which is part of the package. But originalism in itself does not tell you how much weight to give to stare decisis. And her writings have been, as I understand it, in the mainstream of the conservative wing of the court. Court watchers note that the conservative justices differ a lot between themselves in how they bring stare decisis to bear. You have, on the one hand, Justice Clarence Thomas, who is the least inclined to let something wrong stand just because it's been there for a long time, or even because a lot of people have relied on it. Thomas is the most willing to say, no, it's our job to correct our errors, particularly on constitutional law, and get right what we got wrong 10 or 40 or even 148 years ago. So Thomas kind of defines the let the heavens fall approach to stare decisis. Justice Scalia himself was famously kind of in the middle. He called himself a faint-hearted originalist because he said he could easily rattle off a list of cases that were wrongly decided, but he just didn't have the heart to pull out the props from the whole structure, knowing how much disruption, knowing how much reliance. And then you have ones like Chief Justice John Roberts, for example, that again are considerably more toward the center than Scalia was. Roberts has been called an institutionalist. He really doesn't like rocking the boat. He doesn't like fast extreme changes. That explains quite a few of his votes. And then you've got the others, Alito, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch, all with different positions in between. Gorsuch, although not the most substantively conservative justice, he is a little less respectful of stare decisis than some. He is willing to get in there and consider some pretty serious overturning where he thinks the Constitution is clear. So where does she fit in? Probably somewhere between Thomas and maybe Alito and Gorsuch. She will not probably be like Roberts. She is probably not going to be so respectful of stare decisis as to be mostly a force against change. And of course, on many of the issues that people are interested in, issues that have had 5-4 divisions, that could make a big difference.
Now, we've kind of jumped into sort of, how shall I say, the give and take within the conservative movement. But another way to approach this issue is to address this sort of meta issue of the way the public or politics approaches Supreme Court nominations. And I think it's fair to say that there is a perception, especially on the left, but it's certainly true on the right too, in some respects, that the way Supreme Court justices should vote or do vote or respond to cases is like a policymaker expressing their personal preferences, and that, you know, if you've got a religious conviction, then that's the way you're going to express that. Now, we've talked about it in terms of stare decisis and this notion that judges, you know, in looking at the law, looking at the history, are very much constrained, and maybe even constrained is the wrong word, but are obligated or follow what prior law is and make appropriate adjustments where there's some confusion to be addressed. But do you want to address this issue of this kind of notion of the Supreme Court as sort of a super policy chamber as opposed to a body that has to more narrowly apply the law?
So, this is a vital point to understand about the court, and policy-oriented, although fine for economists and others, is kind of an insult word among judges and among the conservative judges in the court. Scalia approached this in a number of different directions. He said that unless you are sometimes handing down decisions where you have to let the wrong side win, you're not a good judge, because sometimes the language is just there that isn't the language you would have wanted. Sometimes Congress has passed a law that isn't the law you would want them to pass, but you have to enforce the words of those laws as they were written. I think Scalia once said that he thought of having a rubber stamp made up with the words "dumb but constitutional," and for every time that he had to uphold a law that he knew was a stupid law, but it's not the court's job to replace its own judgment for legislators' judgment. It has to let the legislators be wrong across a wide range of cases, so long as they are not overstepping the Constitution. And that, of course, is when the judges do have to step in, because at that point, the whole thing turns upside down. Even if it's a smart, good law, even if it's being passed for good reasons, if it oversteps the Constitution, the conservative justice, or really any good justice, has to take a deep breath and say, sorry, sympathize, love the law, can't violate the Constitution, out it goes. So they are not, and I think this is true of all of the justices that we've had for quite a while. They are not just reading their own policy into all the cases. Where the rub comes is that sometimes there's leeway for them to read their policy into some of the very close cases.
And that probably is a good point to segue into the issue that particularly the Democrats teed up. It's certainly one that's been adjudicated before, but is the status of the Obamacare, which was addressed. It has been sort of chipped away at different aspects or some issues about the individual mandate. Can you elaborate a little bit? I mean, obviously there was a lot of political, how shall I say, hoopla about what a case like that could involve and what the consequences were. Can you kind of explain can you give us more of the context of what's happening there?
The Democrats attacked on Obamacare. I think they had some polls saying the public was afraid of it being completely struck down and didn't support that outcome. But in order to do that, they had to really misrepresent the course of how the litigation has evolved. It is true that early on, there were attempts to get Obamacare struck down completely. And we all remember the case in which Chief Justice Roberts said, oh, this is a tax, not a mandate. And it wasn't a very believable argument, but nonetheless, it kicked the football forward. And the case that is now before the court is very different. Since then, there has been a lot of talk about and I'm sorry to introduce the term that only lawyers could love, and we who love lawyers could love, which is severability. Severability is if you've got a law that is partly flawed, and they've got to strike down part of it, do they strike down the whole thing, or do they just cut out the part that is wrong or unconstitutional? And the severability issues, as I say, they will make everyone's eyes glaze over, but most of the people I know say that it's reasonably clear in this case that the court will seize on that as reason to leave most of Obamacare standing, whatever it does on the sub-issue. So knowing that that's the nature of the current case, for Democratic senators to stand up and go on, really, frankly, for days, saying that not only that Barrett would kill Obamacare, but that she had been somehow nominated for that reason, which is just nonsense on top of nonsense, because obviously she was nominated because of the overall approach she brings to issues. And so, no one really knows for sure all the time what the court will do on cases, but the bets from the smart money are don't expect a blockbuster result in the Obamacare case. Depending, of course, on the composition of the new Congress and president, there will undoubtedly be more congressional revisits to the area. There will be attempts to strike new compromises, or if the Democrats get in, they can take guidance from what the court has found unconstitutional and construct more socialized systems that don't happen to have those problems legally. So these are things to know when you hear that, when you hear Judge Barrett attacked on those grounds. It's nothing specific to her. This is a narrow rather than a wide case, and it's especially ridiculous to imagine that someone picked her in order to affect the Obamacare case.
I'm trying to remember how many pages the Obamacare law was, but it was very long, and there were a lot of provisions in it that could or stood on their own, which is the issue of severability, that you could knock down one provision without affecting the other. That was, of course, an issue with the tax versus mandate question that you mentioned before, because there was at that point some suggestion that the whole regime of insurance and protection for pre-existing condition depended on everybody being in the insurance pool, and therefore everybody being required to have insurance. And these subsequent cases really don't reflect that. But let me go back to that. And I was thinking, you talked about Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, as an institutionalist. And it struck me as really kind of an appropriate thing to talk to thread to pull on, because of course the Democrats, well, there's been some suggestion by some Democrats about packing the court, adding additional justices. And it does seem that the part of the sort of institutional response that Roberts may have is to be very, how shall I say, politically sensitive to protect the court from getting embroiled into political questions and to try and decide things narrowly and avoid those kind of frontal questions. Is that a fair characterization?
It is a fair characterization, and it explains quite a few of the things that Roberts has done over the years, including trying to avoid big disruptive decisions, trying to avoid unpopular ways of describing decisions, looking for opportunities to cooperate. Justice Elena Kagan over on the liberal side has frequently tried to forge little compromises of the center in which they agree to shrink a case to not very explosive issues and then get the case off their plate that way by finding something to agree on to get rid of the case. And Roberts is definitely the most open to that approach. I think that Kavanaugh also has probably quite a bit of institutionalism in that he's from the DC circuit, and he very much wants government to operate smoothly. He sees things from the standpoint of let's not demolish structures overnight and so forth. But from Roberts' standpoint, of course, a downside from a conservative standpoint, or almost any standpoint, is that it leaves Roberts open to a bit of blackmail, if you want to call it that, which is that the more unreasonable the critics of the court on the left want to be, the more of a shadow they can cast on the Supreme Court, even when it's trying to do something fairly reasonable, that it would not expect controversy from. If they can make controversy and get it to back off or get it to take only a small step instead of a big step, then the threat of disruption or the threat of institutional retaliation of the sort that court packing is emblematic of, but also the stuff that Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island goes on demagogically with threats to attack the courts in various ways. This has its effect on Roberts, certainly, and not necessarily on some of the others, but that may be enough to swing the case. Now, people talk a lot about who is the swing justice, and it's very dramatic to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the most reliable liberals, with Amy Coney Barrett, who everyone expects to be one of the most reliable and principled conservatives. What that means is that the swing justice status held for so long by Anthony Kennedy and held before him by Sandra Day O'Connor, which John Roberts inherited as the middle justice. Now it's not Roberts anymore. Now it might be Kavanaugh, it might be, of course, depending on what issue you're looking at. It's probably not going to be Alito or Thomas, and we don't know yet about Barrett. But all of a sudden, that really is a shift in the court, because Kavanaugh and Gorsuch are measurably more conservative in their approach to jurisprudence. They're measurably more originalist in their philosophy, for example. They are more interested in textualism than the liberal justices. And so, as you know, as a lawyer, there's a sort of fun card in the pack here, which is that the Chief Justice gets to decide who writes an opinion, so long as he's in the majority. And Roberts has used that power very effectively because as someone who was both the Chief Justice and the swing justice, he could assign himself or he can assign a justice who he knew was going to kind of write quiet or write down or not do something that is going to provoke weeks and weeks of public outrage. Now he's perhaps lost some of that power. Now he may find himself in a minority of 4 against 5 conservatives, at which point is it Clarence Thomas? Whoever is most senior then gets to assign the opinion. Very different dynamics can come out if in those close 5-4 cases, it's written by one of the real torchbearers rather than by someone who is just trying to say no more than necessary.
That's an interesting observation. I certainly hadn't thought about. Thank you very much. Can I get a little wonky, at least at a topic that is certainly particularly important in Washington, which is home of the regulatory state. And there has been a principle, I guess, Chevron deference, but there's been a principle that the courts will look to regulatory agencies as agencies with expertise. And give them deference to say, well, you're the FC, you pick your agency, you're the expert agency, and this is the conclusion that you've reached, and you've gone through all the appropriate administrative processes to reach that decision, which can be a significant issue. The courts will allow them to go forward. Now, there has been obviously some criticism of this, some suggestion that many conservatives would say rightly, that regulatory agencies have gone well beyond the authority that was granted to them by Congress, that was delegated to them by Congress, and that in many instances that, quote, deference that is being applied shouldn't be granted to them. Now, there's been some suggestion that that is sort of a doctrine that may end up getting kind of turned on its head. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, indeed. I think this is one of the areas to watch as one that may see a pretty early impact of replacing Ginsburg with Barrett. That Chevron deference, as lawyers call it, is not something that goes back throughout all history. In fact, it dates back to a decision during our lifetimes. And again, the position of Justice Scalia is interesting because Justice Scalia was the great authority on administrative law, which is the branch of law that this is from, of his court. And he endorsed Chevron because he was too afraid of activist courts that would ignore a genuinely expert regulatory agency, throw out all of the careful records that they had built. And Scalia formed his ideas in an era in which activist judges were constantly stepping in. Some federal agency like the Highway Administration or the Army Corps of Engineers had laid out all sorts of expert reasons why it was okay to build a dam or a highway or a bridge. And then some judge would come in with a 22-year-old law clerk and knock it all over and substitute the court's judgment for that of the expert agency. So Scalia had seen a lot of those cases, both when he was in the executive branch himself and when he served on the DC Circuit. So he welcomed the idea of more deference for regulatory agencies. And then slowly, it took a long time, he began to change his mind when he saw that there were big problems with letting the regulatory agencies have too much deference. They could take and run away with that. There were all sorts of ways in which they could abuse the rights of the citizens. And then there wouldn't be a very good judicial remedy against them because so many of the factual issues would have to be decided in favor of the agency because of that deference. So people were speculating at the time of the Justice Scalia's death that he might actually be part of a new majority to overturn Chevron or at least change to some other formula. The court has addressed variations on this issue, and there's nothing that is not complex if not administrative law. So there are lots of little twists and variations, but the sense was definitely in the air. The movement was in the air that even had there not been a sixth justice, this is an area the court wants to revisit. In particular, Justice Neil Gorsuch has made this a real case of his. He's from Colorado. He identifies with, as it were, the people instead of the federal government. He doesn't like this idea of so much deference to Washington. And he has kind of raised the flag and not been alone in saying let's go revisit this. It's not working.
So that may be an area. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to say that, so far as I know, we don't have a very clear idea of where Amy Coney Barrett comes down on this particular issue. The Seventh Circuit, being in Chicago and the Midwest rather than Washington, doesn't hear that many appeals of regulatory cases. And so she doesn't happen to have had a chance to write about it. So we are opening an envelope without knowing what's inside. On the other hand, we do know where Justice Ginsburg stood, and she's unlikely to be as deferential to the needs of big government as Justice Ginsburg, by philosophical disposition, was.
There has been a tendency for more of these cases to come up through the DC circuit than with the other circuits, and therefore there's a body of opinions to be able to draw on. Are there any cases out there that might, well, there are always cases, but are there particular cases that might raise this particular issue and we should be watching for?
I don't know what cases are in the hopper right now. They come along fairly fast because, of course, this type of controversy is replicated thousands of times a year.
Right.
So when the court wants to find cases that relate to it, and maybe that will be the ones that are accepted in the next year's batch, but nonetheless, it's pretty easy for the court to find cases in this area should it want to revisit it. And people will be as usual, looking for highly sympathetic cases, looking for cases where perhaps the agency was quite wrong and was deferred to anyway by a court.
So it will be interesting to watch. One of the topics we haven't addressed yet is one that obviously creates the most sound and fury, and that is when the court has addressed what most people would regard as being social issues. And this has been, I think, fair to say, one of the areas in which the court has been challenged a lot, where the perception, at least, is that political questions that may have been evolving within society, legislatively at the state level, end up being decided by the courts, particularly the Supreme Court. Now, obviously, this is really one of the sources of great polarization that's taken place with the courts, although people I'm old enough to remember what people thought of the Warren Court, so I won't, it's predated that. There were certainly, the court has never been without its detractors, but that has been certainly one of the issues that has divided the public going back. What are your A, thoughts about that, and B, do you see that any of those types of cases coming up in the future?
Well, of course, people are watching very closely on several of those issues, especially abortion and the question of whether Roe v. Wade, which has survived the appointment of one Republican justice after another without really going away, although it has shifted to different grounds and been somewhat pared away for some types of state law. But will this make the difference finally? And I will not venture any predictions. I do always start out though by saying that abortion is sui generis. It is not like the other issues you may think of here. It is something where there was never a national consensus, and it was never accepted. And the conservative dissents began very early, and the conservative dissents began signaling very early that they did not want to just move the boundaries a little bit. They were discontented with the entire Roe regime. And so if it is overturned, and I'm not making any predictions, there will have been a long foreshadowing and lead-up period. And the court tends not to overturn important precedents, especially on hot-button issues, without going through a very considerable softening up period in which typically several justices make it clear that they want the precedent overturned. Eventually they revisit it, and even then, the court leaves in place the great majority of precedents that would not have been agreed to by a majority of justices. As the Rehnquist court, for example, and the Roberts court replaced the old Warren court, they did not overturn most of the Warren Court precedents. Here and there where something was working badly. So then that gets us to the next point, which is the precedent working badly? I think that that's kind of an irrelevant question for Roe, because it's not a question of whether there has to be a lot of litigation. It's not a question as to whether or not businesses can plan anything, or whether or not people have built a home that has to be torn down or something. And none of those issues really apply to Roe, which is one reason it's easier to talk about completely overturning it. Now, the precedent that is much more recent, but which people sometimes set alongside it, is Obergefell or gay marriage. And there, as I've written in a couple of articles, I don't think that the Supreme Court, and I don't think even if there's another conservative nominee or two, I don't think they're going to overturn that, because the attitude toward it is different, public opinion is different, and the reliance issues are such that there would be chaos and shrapnel and rubble everywhere if they tried to overturn it. So besides possibly Justice Thomas, maybe Justice Alito, they're nowhere near 5, but they're nowhere near 4 on that one. And where you will see, and this is going to be a big, big case this fall, is court wants religious liberty to be revisited. It's no coincidence that religious liberty cases have been coming up again and again and again in recent terms. Conservatives have won a lot of, some small and some fairly large, as with the Montana school choice case. Conservatives have tended to be winning when the precedent has changed. And we know that here again, there's a complicated history in which the court backed away from some of the religious liberty protections that it once accorded, requiring that laws accommodate people. This was under the old regime in which the Amish, for example, there was a milestone case that the Amish didn't have to send their kids to school. And then the court backed off that, and for the last 30 years has said no, unless you can prove that it was biased against religion, or unless you can prove that it's not a neutral or generally applicable law, we're not going to recognize any constitutional conscience rights. And that has led to an enormous amount of discontent and lots of litigation, as many religious thinkers and many libertarian thinkers think they got it wrong. There's got to be some content to freedom of worship other than they can completely arbitrarily tell you, to do something that violates your faith. And so, the case this year, the main case this year, is Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. Complicated case. City of Philadelphia did something that wasn't very complicated, which is that they said city foster care would only work with people who took all sorts of parents rather than just married couples. Catholic Social Services said, we're not going to change our traditional Catholic approach on this, see you in court. It's complicated because earlier cases have not presented, like this one, a situation where there are government contracts involved and there's government subsidy money involved. And those are reasons why Catholic Social Services might not do as well as if it were an independent foster care agency. Nonetheless, the court has taken it. It will hear the oral argument the day after the presidential election, and everyone's watching it very closely because the court wants to do more for religious liberty. Is this the right case for it? Only they know.
That's interesting. Now, are there other cases? We're coming up towards a little bit of the end, but do you have any predictions of sleeper cases that are moving forward? Obviously, we only know a little bit about this term, but what are you watching that you might be a page one story in the coming year?
Well, I don't know whether page one is right, but there's a fun story that we should all be interested in if we're interested in government structures in Washington and elsewhere, which is, I think it's called Adams versus Coney, and that's the one from Delaware. Delaware has an unusual system for its courts. As we know, the Delaware courts are much sought after for corporate headquarters, and so they try to provide high quality law. And one of the tricks of the Delaware system is you can't have more than 50% plus one of judges on the Supreme Court from one party. So no matter how many Democratic governors of Delaware there are, the Democrats can't completely take over the Delaware Supreme Court. And they've also got a rule saying that so that they can keep track of the partisan affiliations, you can't get appointed as a judge on the Delaware Supreme Court unless you are affiliated with the party. If you are a good lawyer who's a registered independent, you're out of luck, and no appointment for you. Now, eventually this was sued, and that's the case that's before the Supreme Court now, by a lawyer who is registered as an independent and says, under this setup, I can never be considered as an appointee to the Delaware Supreme Court. This is not only unfair, it's unconstitutional. And I tag this as more than just a kind of fun law school example, because if the court went all the way in agreeing with this case and said no more political balance on any government commissions, everyone who works in Washington can immediately think, wait a minute, Federal Communications Commission, Federal Elections Commission, there are lots of different structures, and even in a state like Maryland, there are tons of government structures that by their legal charter require representation in the minority party. And that would be very destabilizing and disruptive to the workings of the federal government. It could mean, for example, that an incoming Biden administration could kick all the Republicans out of everything, or vice versa if a re-elected Trump administration saw fit to do that. I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to have a narrower decision saying you got to change the law to let independents have their chance, but it's okay to have the 50% plus one part of the rule. That's my prediction.
Not more than plus one for a majority party. There's probably a language workaround that would address that would allow for
they can have
independents
a majority, but they can't have one past the majority.
Yeah, right. But I'm how shall I say? I'm probably mind melding Robert's clerk as a as a way of keeping things very narrow in terms of its potential impact. Are there Second Amendment cases coming up?
Well, everyone expects there will be Second Amendment cases because although in her 3 years on the appeals court, Amy Coney Barrett has not ruled on some important issues. She did a very big Second Amendment case on the question of what the Constitution has to say about disqualification of people to ever own a gun again if they've had a felony. And her opinion, which was really a tour de force, it was a brilliant and historically informed opinion, concluded that basically, yes, you can prevent most of you can keep the violent felons from ever owning guns again, but you can't keep, let's say, Martha Stewart with her inside trading conviction. If it's an intrinsically nonviolent thing, the practice of the courts back to the day of the ratification of the Second Amendment would not have allowed permanent deprivation of a gun. Now, unfortunately, that was a case where she was in a minority, one of the very few, if any. Hers was not the majority view. But I can tell you that it kind of made her very well known in constitutional circles. It was originalism done right. And it also suggested that she's probably a believer in the Second Amendment, because if she believed that gun rights were second-tier rights, that they weren't really as important, odds are that she would have gone along with the majority of justices on her three-judge panel who did kind of think that.
That's very interesting. I'm going to ask one last question, and I'm going to loop back to an issue that you've been very involved with. So this may have been one that you've given some thought about. How about redistricting? Do you see anything? Obviously, one of the issues is the Voting Rights Act, a variety of issues that come before the courts. Do you foresee litigation down the road having a substantial impact in the way we define our legislative boundaries?
Everyone is looking for election-related litigation to be important at the Supreme Court because it's a presidential year, because the court is closely split, because the decision in Shelby County on the Voting Rights Act has ticked off Democrats and various other reasons. However, redistricting is probably not an area where the Supreme Court will have many chances to weigh in because, as we know, in the term that a couple years ago, they basically pulled the rug out from under it. And that was a 5-justice conservative majority, which is probably going up to 6 now because Ginsburg was among the dissenters. Amy Coney Barrett is very likely to join the conservative majority in saying that there is no constitutional federal court remedy or gerrymandering, however bad it is. And we in Maryland, of course, had cases in those two terms. That having been said, it's frustrating in Maryland because the Maryland Constitution gives a complete blank check in drawing House districts. And as we know, that's been abused to write very outrageous districts in the past. And because the court doesn't show any signs of wanting to revisit that interpretation of the Maryland Constitution, it's hard to systematically get court-driven reform of redistricting. You can do things here and there. For example, you can, with the state house districts, the ones for Annapolis, the language is somewhat better, and every so often the courts will strike down something on that. There are possible ways of going after gerrymandering, sometimes as a violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And I know that sounds like kind of a left cushion, using a law that mostly liberals and Democrats are enthusiastic about to correct what Maryland Democrats have done. Nonetheless, it's been suggested that, and maybe I don't want to give away too much, but it's been suggested that certain aspects of what the Democrats have done with Maryland gerrymandering might be vulnerable to a Voting Rights Act challenge.
Well, we'll leave that as a teaser. We're coming up on about 45 minutes, but we Marylanders will be waiting for that. Walter, I just want to thank you very much. I think we've had a very engaging discussion, and I really thank you for coming on and sharing with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Of course, all of this will be available on YouTube on our page in the future, so you can even listen more carefully to what was said.